Hello there, and welcome to the Silent Souls. Tonight, we'll be exploring the quiet, echoing halls of a familiar place, the school. By day, these buildings are filled with the vibrant energy of learning and life. But when the last bell rings and the doors close, they become something else entirely. Repositories of memory, vessels for echoes, and keepers of stories that linger long after the students have gone home. These are not tales of fiction, but quiet accounts of the unexplained, the atmospheric, and the subtly haunting. If you enjoy these gentle journeys into the mysterious, you're welcome to like and subscribe, or share a thought in the comments below. It helps our community of quiet listeners grow, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, settle in. Let the noise of the day slip away and allow yourself to be carried into the world of the most disturbing true horror stories of school. Let's begin. The town of Oakhaven did not so much sleep as it settled, each night, into a deep and mossy silence. It was a place woven into the fabric of the English Midlands, a tapestry of stone cottages, winding lanes, and a history that was less written down than it was absorbed into the very mortar of the buildings. The air often carried the damp, earthy scent of peat and old rain, and the landscape rolled in gentle green swells, as if the earth itself was breathing slowly. At the heart of this quiet world stood Blackwood School, a Victorian edifice of dark red brick and ivy that clung like a stubborn memory. Its most prominent feature was the clock tower, a square four-story sentinel that pierced the low-hanging sky, its face a pale, stoic moon against the brick. The bell within that tower had not officially rung since the summer of 1954. This was not a matter of legend or hearsay. It was a matter of council records and the failing health of one Mr. Albright, the last custodian who knew the intricate, groaning machinery intimately. The mechanism, a masterpiece of wrought iron and brass weights, had succumbed to decades of rust and fatigue. A crucial gear had sheared clean through, and with the post-war austerity and a shift in priorities, the funds for its repair were never allocated. The great weights, which once descended with a stately week-long gravity, were locked in place. The pendulum was still. The school, and by extension the town, learned to tell time by other means: the wireless, the reliable chime of the smaller church clock a mile away, and the simple, relentless turning of the earth. The silence from the tower became part of the town's soundscape, as natural as the wind in the oaks from which the town took its name. Parents who had heard the bell in their own school days would sometimes pause, waiting for a sound that never came, feeling a small, phantom tug of a past rhythm. For the children, the still clock face was simply how things were. The tower was a dormant giant, a picturesque relic. This is where our story truly begins, not with a clap of thunder or a shriek in the night, but with the gentlest of anomalies. A detail so fine it was almost missed. Eleanor Vance was a woman whose life was built on the reliable architecture of routine. A widow for 7 years, she lived in a cottage whose back garden kissed the edge of the school's playing fields. Her life was a quiet composition of small rituals: the precise timing of her tea, the tending of her roses, and the nightly listening to the World Service on her old Bakelite radio. She was not a fanciful woman. She had been a nurse during the war, and her hands, though now more accustomed to soil and knitting needles, still remembered the unflinching certainty of facts. A pulse, a temperature, a time of death. It was on a night in late September, the air crisp with the first true bite of autumn, that the anomaly occurred. Eleanor was in her kitchen washing the single cup and saucer from her evening cocoa. The window above her sink was open a crack, and the only sounds were the gentle clink of porcelain and the distant lonely cry of a fox. Then it came. It was not a loud sound. It was not the full-throated brass roar that would have shaken the windows in the old days. It was a muffled, dampened bong, as if heard from the bottom of a deep well. It was a single note, resonating with a profound, sonorous weight that seemed to vibrate not through the air, but through the bones of the earth itself. It hung in the silence for a long moment before fading away, leaving a vacuum of sound that felt deeper and more profound than the previous quiet. Eleanor's hands stilled in the warm water. She did not gasp or startle. She simply stood, her head tilted, her entire being focused on the memory of the sound. She waited, counting the seconds in her head, a habit from her nursing days. 1 minute passed. 2. The night offered nothing more. Her first practical thought was of an intruder. Some children, perhaps, had finally managed to break into the tower and had struck the bell as a prank. But the sound was wrong for that. A prank would be a clang, a jarring metallic shriek. This had been a singular, mournful tone, full of a purpose she could not name. She finished the dishes, methodically drying and putting away the cup. She checked the lock on her back door, drew the curtains, and prepared for bed. But sleep was elusive. The sound echoed in the chambers of her memory, a ghost of a vibration. It was 3:17 a.m. She had glanced at the clock on her mantelpiece the moment the sound faded. She was certain of it. The next morning, under a sky the color of pale slate, she mentioned it to Arthur Pendleton, the school's head groundskeeper, when she saw him unlocking the side gate. Arthur was a man in his late 60s, his face a roadmap of wrinkles earned from a lifetime spent outdoors. "Arthur," she said, her voice casual, "I heard a funny noise last night, around 3:15. Sounded like it came from the school." Arthur paused, his key still in the lock. He was a man of few words, and each one was weighed carefully before being spent. "What sort of noise, Mrs. Vance?" "Like a bell," she said, "a single chime, muffled though, as if it were covered in cloth." Arthur's brow furrowed. He looked up at the silent clock tower, its face blank and impassive. "Not possible. The mechanism seized solid. Has been for 40 years. The bell ropes rotted away to dust. You sure it wasn't the church? The wind can play tricks, carry the sound strange sometimes." "It wasn't the church," Eleanor said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She had heard the church bell all her life. This was different. "It came from the tower." Arthur gave a non-committal grunt, a sound that could have meant anything from "I'll look into it" to "You're a dear woman, but you're hearing things." He touched the brim of his flat cap and turned back to his work. Eleanor let it go. She was not one to press, but she knew what she had heard. A week passed. The incident might have faded into the background of her mind, filed away as one of life's small, inexplicable mysteries, had it not happened again. This time, she was in bed, reading. The digital clock on her bedside table glowed 3:14 a.m. She put her book down, a strange premonition holding her still. She waited. At 3:15 a.m. exactly, the sound came again. Bong, the same deep, muffled single note. It was slightly clearer this time. The air must have been stiller. It was a sound of immense age and profound loneliness. It didn't just mark the hour. It seemed to embody it, to pull the very essence of 3:15 a.m. out of the darkness and give it a voice. It resonated through the quiet of her cottage, a vibration that seemed to settle in the marrow of her bones before fading once more into an absolute, listening silence. This time it was different. This time, it was a pattern. The following day, Eleanor did not go to Arthur. She went to the town library, a small, hushed building that smelled of old paper and polish. She sought out the local history section, a single shelf presided over by Miss Thistlethwaite, a librarian so ancient and desiccated she seemed to be part of the archives herself. "I'm interested in the history of Blackwood School," Eleanor said, "particularly the clock tower." Miss Thistlethwaite peered at her over half-moon spectacles. Her eyes were a faded blue but sharp. "Are you now?" "Not many are. It's just the old tower." She led Eleanor to a small, dusty table and brought her a folio of old photographs and a few typed sheets, the school's centenary booklet from 1975. Eleanor spent the afternoon there, her fingers tracing grainy black and white images of stern-faced children in pinafores and short trousers. She found a photograph of the clock room itself, a cavernous space filled with a bewildering array of gears, levers, and the two immense iron weights. In another photo, a man with a kind, tired face and a large moustache stood proudly beside the mechanism. The caption read, "Mr. Lawrence Hibbert, Head Custodian, 1932-1954. He was the last one," a voice said softly beside her. Miss Thistlethwaite had materialized without a sound. Mr. Hibbert knew that clock like it was his own child. They said he could tell the weather by the sound of its chime. Died the year it broke, summer of '54. Eleanor looked up. How did he die? How did... Here, the librarian said, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if the books themselves might be listening. In the school. Heart attack. They found him at the foot of the tower stairs. She paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. It was a Tuesday. They say he was working late, trying to fix a sticking gear before the end of term assembly. A cold finger traced a path down Eleanor's spine. What time was he found? Miss Thistlethwaite's faded eyes held hers. Early in the morning. The cleaning woman found him when she came in, around 6:30. But that wasn't the right answer. The time wasn't specific enough. Eleanor thanked her and left, the image of Mr. Lawrence Hibbert fixed in her mind. That evening, she made a decision. She would not be a passive listener to this mystery. If the bell was going to ring, she would be a witness. She would go to the source. The next night, armed with a powerful torch and a healthy dose of determination, Eleanor Vance waited until well past midnight. She pulled on a warm coat and sturdy shoes and let herself out into the sleeping world. The moon was a sliver of bone in a sky thick with stars. Her breath plumed in the cold air as she crossed the dewy grass of the playing field, the school looming before her, a silhouette of darkened windows and jagged roof lines. She knew the school grounds intimately. There was a loose board in the fence behind the bicycle sheds, a secret known to generations of children, including her own son, decades ago. She found it with ease, her fingers working the familiar knot of wood. It gave way with a soft creak, and she slipped through into the asphalt yard. The tower was accessed through a heavy oak door at the rear of the main building. It was always locked, but Eleanor had remembered something else from her son's school days. A high, narrow window around the side of the tower, leading to the basement boiler room that never quite latched properly. She found it, hidden behind a thick curtain of ivy. With effort, she pushed it open, the rusted hinges protesting with a squeal that tore through the silence. She shone her torch inside, revealing a dusty concrete floor and the hulking shapes of the furnaces. It was a tight squeeze, but she managed to clamber through, landing with a soft thud on the other side. She was in. The air was thick and still, smelling of old dust, oil, and cold stone. Her torch beam cut a swath through the darkness, illuminating a narrow, winding staircase of stone steps that spiraled upwards into blackness. This was the old servants' staircase, the direct route to the tower, long since closed off from the main school. She began to climb. The steps were worn smooth in the center from countless footsteps over more than a century. Her own footsteps seemed deafeningly loud, each one a small explosion of sound in the profound quiet. Cobwebs brushed against her face, and she could hear the faint, skittering sounds of unseen things in the shadows. She was not afraid of the dark, nor of spiders. She was afraid of the silence and what it might be about to break. She climbed past the first landing, then the second. The air grew colder. Finally, she reached a small wooden door, warped with age and studded with iron nails. This was the door to the clock room. She tried the handle. It was locked, of course, but next to it was a smaller, even narrower door, barely more than a hatch. This, she knew from the photographs, was the access to the bell chamber itself. It was secured with a simple, heavy bolt. Gripping the cold, rough iron, she slid the bolt back. It moved with a gritty, reluctant scrape. She took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped through. She was in the belfry. The space was open on all four sides, the cold night air flowing freely through the arched openings. The moon provided a faint, silver light, painting the scene in monochrome. And there, in the center, hung the bell. It was immense, larger than she had imagined, cast from dark, pitted bronze. It was suspended from a massive wooden beam, thick as a tree trunk. Below it, hanging limp and frayed, was the remnant of the bell rope, little more than a dusty cord. This was the heart of the mystery, this silent, colossal instrument. She walked to the edge of one of the arches and looked out. Her cottage was a tiny, dark shape in the distance. She could see the entire sleeping town of Oakhaven spread out below her, a collection of slumbering lives. She checked her watch. 3:10 a.m. She settled herself on a wooden crate in a corner, pulling her coat tight around her. The cold was penetrating, seeping through her clothes. She switched off her torch, letting the moonlight and her own night vision take over. The silence was absolute, a physical presence. It was the silence of a place that had been forgotten by time. 5 minutes passed. The cold bit deeper. She began to question her sanity. What was she doing here? A woman of 72 sitting in a freezing bell tower in the middle of the night based on two faint sounds. 3:14 a.m. A change occurred in the atmosphere. It was subtle, a shift in pressure. The absolute silence seemed to become a listening silence. The air grew stiller, if that was possible. The faint sounds of the night, the rustle of a leaf, the distant hoot of an owl, vanished. The world was holding its breath. 15 a.m. It began not with a sound, but with a movement. Directly above the great motionless bell, the massive clapper, the iron tongue suspended inside the bell, twitched. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. A shudder. Then it swung. It did not swing with the force of a human hand pulling a rope. There was no visible cause. It moved of its own accord, with a slow, deliberate, and impossible grace. It drew back, an inch, then two, then a foot, as if pulled by an invisible string. It hovered for a fraction of a second at the apex of its swing, and then it fell forward. It struck the inner rim of the bell. Bong. The sound was not muffled here. It was pure, vast, and overwhelming. It was not just a noise. It was a physical force. The wave of sound hit Eleanor like a blow to the chest, vibrating through the wooden floor, through the stone walls, through the very atoms of her body. It was a deep, clean, profound note that seemed to cleanse the night air of all other sensation. It was the soul of the hour-given voice. The sound echoed out over the sleeping town, the same single mournful chime she had heard from her cottage. Here, at its source, it was 1,000 times more powerful, more real, more impossible. She watched, transfixed, as the clapper, having struck its single note, swung back to its resting position in the center of the bell and became still. The great bronze dome quivered slightly, then was motionless once more. The sound faded, its resonance swallowed by the night. The ordinary sounds of the world slowly trickled back. But Eleanor Vance remained seated, her heart hammering against her ribs, not with fear, but with a staggering, humbling awe. She had not seen a ghost. She had not witnessed a spectral figure of Mr. Hibbert. She had seen something else entirely. She had seen a memory so powerful, so ingrained in the fabric of this place, that it had taken on a life of its own. It was the echo of a duty, a responsibility so deeply felt by one man that his passing could not erase it. The tower, the clock, the bell, they were not haunted by Lawrence Hibbert's ghost. They were haunted by his devotion. The mechanism was broken. The rope was dust. But the need to mark the hour, the ingrained, unwavering rhythm of a life dedicated to order and time, persisted. It was a fossilized habit, a psychic imprint on the location that played itself out every night at the precise moment of his final solitary act. She sat there for a long time, until the cold became unbearable. She did not feel like an intruder anymore. She felt like a privileged witness to a secret. A silent ritual performed for no audience but the night itself. She made her way back down the spiral staircase, through the basement, and out into the breaking dawn. The world was beginning to stir, but she carried the memory of the sound within her, a secret knowledge. She never spoke of what she saw in the tower. When Arthur Pendleton mentioned a week later, in a hushed and puzzled tone, that he too had heard the bell one night, Eleanor simply nodded. "The wind plays tricks, Arthur," she said, repeating his own words back to him with a gentle smile. "It can carry the sound strange sometimes." And she left it at that. For some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only respected. And every night thereafter at 3:15 a.m., whether she was awake to hear it or asleep in her bed, the bell in the empty clock tower would ring its single faithful chime, a testament to a promise kept long after the keeper was gone, a heartbeat in the silent body of the night. In the flat, agricultural heart of Ohio, where the horizon was a straight line, interrupted only by silos and the occasional cluster of trees, the town of Millersburg was a testament to quiet endurance. Its central landmark was not a church or a town square, but Millersburg High School, a sprawling brick and concrete complex built in the optimistic boom of the 1950s. And the soul of that school, its cavernous, echoing heart, was the gymnasium. The barn, as it was affectionately known, was a cathedral of adolescence. Its vaulted ceiling of exposed wooden beams soared into darkness. The air always carried the familiar, comforting scent of polished maple floor, old sweat, and the faint, oily tang of the wrestling mats rolled against the wall. 2 sets of bleachers, when pulled out, could hold the entire town for a Friday night basketball game. And from those high, dark beams, thick manila ropes hung down, knotted at the ends, relics of a forgotten PE curriculum. For the students, the barn was a place of triumph and humiliation, of squeaking sneakers and roaring crowds. But for the night custodian, a man named Samuel Jenkins, it was the most challenging space to clean and the quietest place to be alone with his thoughts. Samuel was a large, quiet man who had been the night custodian for nearly 2 decades. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that belied his size, and he knew the school's night rhythms better than he knew the lines on his own hands. He appreciated the gym for its sheer scale, the way sound behaved differently there, amplifying the smallest noise into something significant. He first noticed the shadow during his first year on the job. It was a late autumn night, and a full moon was shining through the high, arched windows, casting long, pale rectangles of light onto the empty floor. He was pushing his wide, quiet buffer across the center court line when a flicker of movement caught his eye. On the far wall, a long, dark shadow was swinging. It was cast from one of the ropes that hung from the ceiling. The shadow was that of a child, thin and elongated, moving back and forth in a slow, lazy arc. It was perfectly formed, the silhouette of a head, a torso, 2 legs swinging freely. It was the shadow of a child on a swing. Samuel stopped the buffer. The machine's whir died, and the gym plunged into a silence so deep it felt like a physical substance. He stared. The shadow continued its gentle, rhythmic swing, back and forth, back and forth. His eyes snapped up to the rope itself. It was perfectly, unnervingly still. The thick, braided manila cord hung straight down, its knotted end a good 5 feet from the floor. There was no weight on it. No movement, no breeze, for the gym was sealed tight. Yet on the wall, the shadow swung. Samuel felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was no trick of the light. The angle was wrong. The light from the moon was coming almost directly down, not from the side where it would cast such a long lateral shadow. He took a step forward. The shadow continued its motion, unaffected. He walked slowly across the vast floor, his footsteps echoing in the immense space. As he drew closer to the wall, the shadow remained, a two-dimensional phantom engaged in its endless solitary play. He was 10 feet away, 5. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and touched the cool, painted cinder block wall. The shadow was superimposed on it. It had no texture, no depth. It was just a darkness, a perfect moving silhouette. And then, as his shadow from the moonlight intersected with it, the swinging shadow vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. The wall was just a wall. He looked up. The rope hung motionless. Samuel was a practical man, a man of mops and wax and broken locker doors. He spent the next week trying to deconstruct the event. He checked for projectors, for faulty wiring, for reflections from passing cars. He came in at the same time the next night. The moon was not as full, the light not as bright. The shadow did not appear. He began to think he had imagined it, a product of fatigue and the strange, isolating nature of the night shift. He filed it away in his mind as a one-time mystery. But a month later, it happened again. And again a few weeks after that. It was never a regular occurrence. It seemed to happen most often on nights with a bright, clear moon, and almost always around the same time, shortly after midnight, when the school was at its most deeply silent. Over the years, Samuel learned its patterns. The shadow only appeared on that one specific rope, the third from the left. It never made a sound. There was no accompanying creak of rope, no childish laughter. There was just the silent, swinging shadow, a pantomime of play in a vacant auditorium. He never saw it form. He would be working, and then he would feel a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change in the quality of the silence, and he would know to look up. And there it would be, already in motion, as if it had been swinging for hours. He tried mentioning it once, cautiously, to the day shift custodian. The man, younger and more pragmatic, had laughed. "Sam, you're spending too much time alone in the dark." So Samuel never spoke of it again. It became his secret, a silent, recurring performance for an audience of one. His curiosity, however, did not fade. He started spending his lunch breaks in the school library, looking through old yearbooks and town histories. He was looking for a connection, a story that would explain the silent swinger. He found it in a box of unsorted memorabilia in the library's storage closet, a scrapbook dedicated to the school's construction. There were photos of the groundbreaking ceremony, of the steel skeleton of the building. And there, tucked between the pages, was a small, yellowed newspaper clipping from the Millersburg Ledger, dated 1957. The headline was small, tragic. "Child falls, school construction site accident." The article was brief. A local boy, 8-year-old Michael O'Malley, had snuck onto the unfinished high school construction site after hours. He had been playing on a pile of materials, pretending they were a jungle gym. He had fallen, striking his head. He was found by a night watchman and rushed to the hospital, but he did not survive. Samuel's blood ran cold. He read the location described in the article. It was the exact spot where the gymnasium now stood. The accident had happened before the floor was laid, before the walls were fully raised. The boy had died in the skeleton of the building that would become the barn. He pictured the scene, the half-built structure open to the night sky, the piles of lumber and steel, a young boy's imagination turning it into a castle, a spaceship, a jungle, and the fall, the sudden, silent end to play. Samuel went back to the gym that night. He didn't turn on the lights. He stood in the center of the floor and looked up at the ropes, at the spot on the wall where the shadow appeared. He understood now. This wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. Michael O'Malley wasn't trapped here in anguish. The gym, built over the place of his final, joyful play, had absorbed that moment. The shadow was not a record of his death, but a fossil of his life, of the simple, physical joy of swinging, of moving through air, of being a child at play. The swinging shadow was a memory, a perfect looping memory of a boy's happiness cast in darkness on a wall, forever separate from the still physical world of the ropes and the floor. From that night on, Samuel never felt unease when he saw the shadow. Instead, he felt a profound, gentle melancholy. He would stop his work and watch for a moment, a silent witness to this echo of childhood. He saw it not as a haunting, but as a gift. A reminder that joy, in its purest form, could be so powerful it left a mark on the world. One night, during a fierce winter storm, the power went out. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim orange glow. The wind howled outside, rattling the high windows. Samuel was making his rounds with a flashlight when he passed the gym. He shone his beam inside. And there it was, the shadow swinging on the wall. It was fainter in the artificial light, but unmistakable. Back and forth, back and forth. In the profound quiet of the power outage, with the storm raging outside, the sight was more poignant than ever. Here, in the dark and the chaos, this one simple memory of play persisted, unchanged, eternal. Samuel smiled softly. He didn't stay. He continued on his rounds, the beam of his flashlight cutting a path through the dark halls. Behind him in the empty gym, the silent shadow continued its endless, joyful swing, a testament to a playtime that never had to end, preserved in the heart of the school forever. The rhythm of Jefferson Junior High was a percussive symphony of its own making. It was the thunder of 100 combination locks snapping open in near unison, the metallic slam of locker doors, the rustle of paper, and the constant bubbling stream of adolescent voices. It was a sound of transient ownership, of claiming a small personal space in a vast impersonal system. Locker 328 was unremarkable. It was situated in the main hallway on the second floor, a standard-issue gunmetal gray cabinet, identical to the 499 others that lined the corridors of the Oregon school. There were no scratches that formed a secret pattern, no lingering sticker residue from a forgotten fad. It was utterly ordinary in every way, except for one thing. It would not stay closed. This was not a matter of a faulty hinge or a warped door. The custodians had checked. The vice principal had inspected it. The district's maintenance crew had replaced the latch mechanism, not once, but twice. They had even swapped the entire door with one from a locker in a storage closet. The result was always the same. By the next morning, no matter how firmly it was slammed shut, locker 328 would be found slightly ajar. For the students, it was a minor legend, a piece of school folklore. They'd give it a wide berth, whispering about the haunted locker. Some dared each other to touch it. A few claimed to feel a weird vibe when they passed by. But for the night custodian, a man named Henry, it was a daily, quiet anomaly that defied his entire worldview. Henry was a man of order. His life's work was to reset the school to a state of pristine readiness each night. He mopped the chaos of footprints from the floors, erased the doodles from the whiteboards, and returned every stray chair to its desk. And every night, without fail, he would walk down the second-floor hallway, see the dark vertical slit of locker 328 standing open, and push it firmly shut. The solid clunk of the latch engaging was a satisfying sound of a problem solved. And every morning during his final pre-bell rounds, he would find it open again. Not wide open, just ajar. As if someone had gently pulled on it, just enough to disengage the latch. He tried everything. He taped it shut with heavy-duty duct tape. In the morning, the tape would be intact, still firmly securing the door to the frame, but the latch itself would be mysteriously disengaged, the The door opened the barest fraction of an inch. He set up a discreet, battery-powered motion sensor aimed at it. It never went off. The locker opened in a zone of perfect, unobserved silence. It was a small thing, a tiny rebellion in the grand scheme of his duties, but for Henry, it was a pebble in his shoe, a single persistent note of discord in his symphony of order. It was the one thing in the entire school he could not fix. His curiosity eventually overpowered his frustration. He started spending his lunch breaks in the school's main office, poring over old class rosters and locker assignments. He was looking for a pattern, a name, a story attached to Locker 328. He went back years, decades. The records were digitized, a cold list of names and numbers. Locker 328 had been assigned to hundreds of students. None of the names stood out. He was about to give up when the school secretary, an elderly woman named Carol, who had worked there since the 1980s, noticed his search. "Still fussing with that locker, Henry?" she asked, a knowing look in her eyes. "It's the principle of the thing," he grumbled. She smiled faintly. "You know, they used to have a different numbering system before the remodel in '92. Locker 328. That would have been Locker 142 in the old wing." A new thread. Henry dug into the physical archives, the cardboard boxes stored in a damp basement room. He found the old, handwritten ledger for locker assignments from the 1970s. His finger, calloused and stained, traced down the list for Locker 142, and he found a name written in a looping feminine cursive that was circled and then crossed out with a single harsh line. Maya Lin. There was no forwarding information, no new locker assignment. It was as if she had simply vanished from the school's records. He looked for her in the yearbooks. He found her in the 1978 freshman class photo, a girl with long, dark hair and a shy, hesitant smile. She was not in the 1979 sophomore class photo. He went back to Carol. "Maya Lin," he said. "What happened to her?" Carol's face softened, her eyes clouding with memory. "Oh, Maya, that was a sad thing. Such a quiet girl, very bright. She left midway through her sophomore year. Her family just packed up and moved away overnight. Rumor was her father had gotten into some kind of trouble. There was a lot of whispering. Kids can be cruel. She was ostracized, bullied, really. She spent a lot of time hiding in that locker of hers, just trying to be invisible." Henry pictured it. A quiet, studious girl, pressed into the narrow, dark space of her locker, the door shut, seeking a moment of peace from the relentless social storm of junior high. It was her sanctuary, her only hiding place. He understood now. The locker wasn't broken. It was remembering. The latch wasn't failing. It was complying with a deeply ingrained habit. The memory of a girl who needed a door that would open for her, a space that would welcome her in, was so powerfully imprinted on that specific metal cabinet that it had become part of its nature. Locker 328 wasn't haunted. It was loyal. It had been Maya's one safe space, the one place where she could shut out the world. And now, years after she was gone, the locker still held that purpose. It refused to stay permanently closed, forever keeping its door slightly ajar. A silent metallic invitation for its owner to return, to seek shelter once more. The gentle, persistent opening was not an act of rebellion, but one of steadfast, enduring welcome. That night, Henry did his rounds as usual. He came to Locker 328. It was, as always, open a sliver. He didn't push it shut with his usual force. Instead, he placed his hand gently on the cold metal door. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper in the sleeping hallway. "She's not coming back. You can rest now." He gave the door a soft push. The latch engaged with a quiet click. He stood there for a long moment, half expecting it to pop open again. It remained closed. The next morning, for the first time in his memory, Locker 328 was shut. It stayed shut for a week. Henry felt a strange sense of accomplishment mixed with a touch of melancholy. He had, he believed, laid a gentle ghost to rest. But the following Monday, he found it open again. Just a crack. The barest suggestion of an opening. He didn't feel frustration this time. He felt a quiet understanding. Some habits, even those forged in metal and memory, are too deep to break completely. The locker's purpose was too fundamental. It was a sentinel, forever standing watch, its door perpetually unlocked for a girl who would never return. A permanent sanctuary in a world that had once been too harsh. Henry never forced it shut again. He would gently close it each night as part of his ritual, a nod to the order he maintained. And each morning he would acknowledge its quiet, stubborn defiance with a small, respectful nod. It was no longer a problem to be solved. It was a story to be honored. A small, metal monument to a lonely girl and the one place that had ever made her feel safe, its door forever open, just in case. New York City is a symphony of noise, a relentless, glorious cacophony that never truly sleeps. But within its sprawling, pulsating body, there are pockets of profound quiet. Public School 23. In the Bronx was one such pocket after the final bell rang at 3 p.m. The shouts of children playing tag in the yard faded, the frantic rhythm of footsteps in the hallways stilled, and the building, a sturdy pre-war structure of pale brick and countless windows, would begin its long exhalation into evening. For Maria Flores, the head custodian, this transition was a daily ritual. She had held the keys to PS 23 for 15 years, a small, wiry woman with hands that could unclog a drain, repair a desk hinge, or comfort a crying kindergartner with equal skill. Her world was one of practical magic, the magic of making broken things whole again, of restoring order from the beautiful chaos of 1,000 young lives. Her nights were a solitary ballet of mopping, polishing, and resetting the school for the next day. She moved through the empty corridors, her cart of supplies rattling a soft metallic accompaniment to her rounds. She knew the building's language, the specific groan of the third step on the west staircase, the way the old pipes in the basement hummed a B-flat when the heat kicked on, the draft that whispered through a cracked window frame on the 4th floor. And she knew about the whistling. It had been one of the first things the day shift custodian, an old-timer named Sal, had mentioned when she'd started. "Just so you know," he'd said, wiping his brow with a red bandana, "the place has a soundtrack at night, on the 3rd floor. You'll hear it. Don't let it spook you. It's just Charlie." "Charlie?" Maria had asked. Sal had just shrugged, a world of unspoken knowledge in the gesture. "He's part of the furniture. Been here longer than any of us." Her first encounter with the sound happened during her first week on the night shift. It was past 1 a.m., and she was buffing the linoleum in the main hallway. The only sounds were the whir of the machine and her own breathing. Then, cutting softly through the hum, came the whistling. It was a tune, but not one she could place. It wasn't a pop song or a nursery rhyme. It was a meandering, cheerful, almost absent-minded sequence of notes. There was no melody you could quite hold on to, but the tone was unmistakably light, even joyous. It sounded like a man without a care in the world, whistling simply for the pleasure of the sound itself. It seemed to be coming from the 3rd floor hallway, the one that housed the older classrooms and the music room. Maria had turned off the buffer. The whistling continued, faint but clear. It didn't sound like it was coming from a radio or a phone. It had an acoustic human quality, as if someone was standing just around the corner. "Hello?" she'd called out, her voice echoing down the empty hall. The whistling stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant. She walked quickly to the end of the hallway and peered around the corner. Nothing. The long corridor was empty, the classroom doors all shut, the nightlights casting small pools of jaundiced yellow on the floor. She'd felt a prickle of unease, but Sal's words came back to her. Don't let it spook you, it's just Charlie. Over the years, the whistling became as much a part of her nightly routine as the scent of lemon-scented disinfectant. She heard it once or twice a week, always on the third floor, always that same, tuneless, cheerful sound. She never saw anyone. She never found an open window or a forgotten radio. It was just there. A sonic fingerprint left on the building. She grew accustomed to it. Sometimes she'd even whistle back, a soft, answering note, though it always seemed to make the original whistling cease. It was a shy presence. Her curiosity eventually got the better of her. During a slow afternoon, she went down to the school's basement archives, a dusty room filled with old yearbooks and administrative records. She found the custodian logs, heavy ledgers bound in green canvas. She started flipping through the older ones, her fingers tracing the faded ink and fountain pen entries. She found him in a log from 1958. The entries were neat, precise, and signed with a flourished C. Maggio, Charles Maggio. The notes were brief. Fixed lock on room 204, unclogged sink in girls' lavatory, polished main stairwell. And at the end of almost every entry, a single added note, all secure. She dug deeper, through payroll records and old staff photos. She found a black and white picture from a 1956 school picnic. There he was, standing a little apart from the teachers, a kind-faced man in his 40s with a thick head of dark, wavy hair and a smile that reached his eyes. He was holding a wrench in one hand, looking more at home than anyone else. The caption read, "Charlie Maggio, always fixing things." She finally found the record of his passing in a brittle typed memo from the principal's office dated February 12, 1959. "It is with profound sorrow that we inform the school community of the passing of Mr. Charles Maggio, our head custodian, who died suddenly of a heart attack on the premises last night. Mr. Maggio was a dedicated and beloved member of the PS23 family for over 20 years. He will be deeply missed." Maria stared at the date. February 12th, 1959. A Thursday. She pictured him finishing his rounds, maybe whistling that cheerful, aimless tune as he checked the last door, ensuring the school was all secure. And then, the silent, sudden attack. Dying in the place he had cared for, the place that was his life's work. She closed the ledger gently. She didn't feel sad. She felt a deep, resonant understanding. Charlie Maggio hadn't left. How could he? This school wasn't just his job, it was his home, his purpose. The whistling wasn't a ghostly remnant of trauma or sorrow. It was the echo of his contentment, the sound of a man perfectly in tune with his world. From that day on, Maria's relationship with the whistling changed. It was no longer a mysterious anomaly. It was a companionship. She began to listen for it, a familiar and comforting presence in the vast, empty building. She learned its patterns. It was most likely to be heard on Thursday nights, the night he died. It was always cheerful, never mournful. One bitterly cold night in January, a pipe burst on the third floor. Water was cascading from a ceiling panel, flooding the hallway. Maria was struggling alone, trying to contain the deluge with towels and mops, her radio crackling as she called for an emergency plumber. The situation was chaotic, the silence of the night shattered by the roar of water and her own frantic movements. And then, cutting through the chaos, she heard it. The whistling. It was the same meandering tune, but this time it didn't sound distant. It sounded close, as if Charlie were standing right beside her looking at the burst pipe. And in that moment, a strange calm settled over her. The panic receded. Her mind cleared. She remembered an old, forgotten main water shut-off valve behind a panel in the janitor's closet down the hall, a valve that wasn't on the modern blueprints. Charlie would have known about it. She sprinted to the closet, pried the panel open, and with a hard turn of the rusted wheel, the roaring water slowed to a trickle. then stopped. The silence that returned was profound. The only sound was her own heavy breathing and the faint, fading echo of a cheerful, tuneless whistle from the far end of the hall. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. It was just Charlie, still doing his job, still keeping the school secure, still fixing things. The whistling of PS-23 was not a haunting, it was a dedication. A love song to a building, whistled by a man whose care for his work was so complete, so integral to his being, that death itself could not interrupt the melody. And for Maria, working through the quiet hours, it was the sound of not being alone, a reminder that some people leave behind not just a memory, but a lasting, benevolent presence, a cheerful whistle in the dark, ensuring that all is and always will be secure. The city of Pittsburgh holds its history not in grand monuments, but in the sweat-stained brick and soot-blackened stone of its industrial past. Carrick High School, a hulking three-story structure built in 1923, was a testament to that era. It was a fortress of education, with corridors wide enough to march a battalion through and windows set deep into walls thick enough to withstand a siege. It smelled perpetually of old wood, industrial cleaner, and the faint metallic tang of the mills that once defined the neighborhood. Within this edifice, on the third floor facing north, was room 314, the advanced chemistry lab. It was a time capsule. While other classrooms had been updated with drop ceilings and fluorescent lights, the lab had been spared, deemed too expensive to renovate due to its intricate plumbing and built-in lead-lined fume hoods. The room was dominated by long, blacktop tables, scarred and stained by decades of experiments. But its most striking feature was the wall of cabinets. These were no ordinary storage units. They reached from the scuffed linoleum floor to the 14-foot-high pressed tin ceiling, constructed from a rich, dark American black walnut. Their surfaces had been hand-rubbed and polished by generations of students and custodians to a deep, liquid sheen. In the dim, perpetually overcast light that filtered through the tall, wire-reinforced windows, the cabinet fronts became more than wood. They became murky, imperfect mirrors, reflecting the lab in a soft, sepia-toned glow. You could see the ghost of yourself moving in the grain, a wavering figure in a world of dark wood and older ways. The custodian who knew this room best was a man named Leo. Leo had been tending to Carrick High for 28 years. He was a quiet, observant man, built solid and low to the ground, with hands that were rough and capable. He moved through the empty school at night with a proprietary calm, his keyring jangling a soft metallic melody that was as much a part of the school's night sounds as the hum of the boilers. He knew every creak in the floorboards, every pipe that knocked, every classroom that held a draft. And he knew there was something about room 314. It hadn't been a sudden thing. It was a realization that had dawned on him over years, like a photograph slowly developing in a dark room tray. It began with a feeling, the simple, primal sensation of being watched. It was most potent when he was mopping the linoleum floor of the chem lab, his back to the wall of cabinets. He would feel a prickle on the nape of his neck, a coolness that had nothing to do with the temperature. He would turn quickly and see only his own reflection, distorted and elongated in the polished walnut. But sometimes his reflection wasn't alone. The first time he saw it clearly, he dismissed it as a trick of the light. It was a Tuesday night, deep in the winter term. A freezing rain was lashing against the windows, and the old building groaned and settled around him. He was in 314, running a damp cloth over the black tabletops to collect the dust. As he straightened up, his eyes automatically flicked to the cabinet front, checking his own disheveled appearance. And there, standing just behind his left shoulder, was another figure. It was a young man. He was pale, his features sharp and intelligent. He wore a white, old-fashioned lab coat, buttoned neatly, and his dark hair was parted severely on the side. His expression was not menacing, nor was it friendly. It was focused, intent. In his hands he held a glass beaker, a simple, thick-walled vessel of the kind no longer used in modern labs. He was looking down at it as if studying its contents. Leo spun around, his heart giving a single, hard thump against his ribs. The space behind him was empty. The long rows of student desks stretched away, vacant. The only sound was the drumming of the rain. He turned back to the cabinet. His own startled face stared back at him. The young man was gone. Leo was a practical man. He dealt in clogged sinks, broken desks, and overflowing trash cans. He did not deal in ghosts. He took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and attributed it to fatigue and the strange, shifting light of the storm. He finished his work quickly and left the room, making a point to shut the door firmly behind him. But the image stayed with him. The sharp, pale face, the old-fashioned lab coat, the beaker. It happened again a month later, and then again a few weeks after that. It was always the same. He would be working in the lab, feel the familiar prickle of awareness, and glance at the cabinet. The young man would be there, standing a few feet behind his reflection, always holding that same beaker, always with that same look of intense concentration. He never moved, never looked up. He was a still life, a painting captured in the reflective surface of the wood. Leo never saw him anywhere else. He never heard footsteps or voices. The phenomenon was confined entirely to that specific reflective surface. It was as if the polished walnut had absorbed a moment in time and was now, under the right conditions, replaying it. He began to change his routine. He would turn on all the overhead lights in 314, banishing the shadows. He would whistle while he worked, filling the silence with sound. He tried to avoid looking at the cabinets altogether, focusing his attention on the floors, the tables, the sinks. But the feeling of being watched was a constant, low-level hum, a frequency only he could hear. And his eyes, against his will, would be drawn back to that dark, gleaming wood. Curiosity eventually overcame unease. He decided to investigate. During his lunch break, he went to the school's administrative office, a place he usually avoided. The current principal, a brisk, efficient woman named Dr. Evans, had only been there for 5 years. She knew the school's present, but not its past. Leo needed to go deeper. He found what he was looking for in the basement archives, a room even he approached with reluctance, a labyrinth of forgotten files and the faint, sweet smell of decaying paper. The records for the school's early decades were kept in large, leather-bound ledgers. He pulled the volume for the 1920s and 1930s and began to turn the heavy, brittle pages. He was looking for a student, a young man who fit the description of the face in the cabinet. He found nothing. The grainy class photo portraits showed rows of unsmiling faces, but none that sparked recognition. Frustrated, he was about to give up when he noticed a smaller, slimmer ledger tucked behind the larger ones. It was labeled Incident Reports, 1925-1950. His pulse quickened. He carried it over to a dusty table under a single bare bulb. He skimmed through reports of broken windows, fistfights, and stolen apples. And then his finger stopped on an entry dated November 12, 1938. Time, 1630, approx. Location, chemistry laboratory, RM 314, involved, Elias Thorne, Sr. Incident. Student Thorne remained after school without permission to work on an independent chemistry project. Custodian Mr. J. Miller, upon entering the lab for evening cleaning, found Student Thorne collapsed at his station. A single beaker was present. No foul play suspected, city ambulance summoned. Pronounced deceased at scene by attending physician. Cause of death, presumed cardiac arrest or acute chemical reaction. Notes, a tragic loss. Student Thorne was a promising, if solitary, scholar. Family notified. Elias Thorne. Leo stared at the name. He looked at the date. 1938. The lab would have been only 15 years old then. The walnut cabinets still knew their polish, fresh and deep. He pictured the scene. A grey November afternoon, the light failing. A serious, dedicated boy, so engrossed in his private experiment that he didn't notice the warning signs in his own body. The quiet gasp. The collapse. The beaker perhaps knocked over, its contents spilling across the black tabletop. He found a yearbook from 1939, which would have been Elias's graduating class had he lived. He turned the pages, his thumb leaving a smudge on the glossy paper. And there he was, in the in memoriam section, a small, formal portrait. It was him. The same sharp, intelligent features, the same severe hair part, the same pale intensity in the eyes. It was the young man from the reflection. Leo closed the yearbook gently, as if it were a sacred text. He felt a strange, somber peace. This wasn't a malevolent spirit. This was an echo. A boy who had died doing what he loved, in the place he felt most himself. His final moment of focused study, his gaze fixed on that beaker, had been so powerful, so defining, that it had somehow been imprinted upon the very room. And the highly polished, resonant surface of the walnut cabinets, a material known to old craftsmen for its ability to hold a memory, had become the vessel for that imprint. That night, Leo returned to room 314. He didn't turn on all the lights. He just stood in the doorway, the faint light from the corridor spilling in. He looked at the wall of cabinets. They were dark, silent. "I know who you are now, Elias," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper in the vast, quiet room. He didn't expect an answer, and he didn't get one. But the oppressive feeling of being watched was gone. It was replaced by a different atmosphere, one of poignant solitude. From that night on, Leo's relationship with the lab changed. He no longer rushed his work there. He would often pause, his cleaning finished, and simply stand for a moment acknowledging the presence. He sometimes felt the faintest drop in temperature, a cool spot in the air near the cabinets, but it was no longer threatening. It was just there, a fact of the room, like the smell of sulfur or the stubborn stain of silver nitrate on table 3. The reflection never appeared to anyone else. A substitute teacher once complained of a weird vibe in the chem lab, and a few sensitive students claimed it was the creepiest room in the school. But no one else saw the pale young man in the old-fashioned coat. The phenomenon was for Leo alone, the night watchman, the keeper of the school's secrets. He realized that Elias Thorne wasn't trying to communicate or frighten anyone. He was simply still at work. His experiment, interrupted by death, was forever in a state of almost completion. He was a perpetual student, forever on the cusp of a discovery that would never come. One evening, near the anniversary of the incident in November, Leo brought something with him to the lab. It was a simple, thick-walled glass beaker, an antique he'd found in a dusty box in the storage room. It was clean and empty. After he finished mopping, he went to the cabinet where the reflection most often appeared. He didn't look at the surface. Instead, he placed the beaker carefully on the black tabletop directly in front of it. "It's here if you need it," he murmured. He left the room, turning off the light. As he pulled the door closed, he glanced back. In the deep gloom, the single beaker on the table caught a sliver of light from the hallway, gleaming like a fallen star. He never saw the reflection of Elias Thorne again. But sometimes when he entered the lab the next night, the beaker would be not where he had left it, but moved a few inches to the left or the right. And the feeling in the room was not one of loneliness, but of quiet, focused industry. Leo understood. Some people leave a ghost, others leave a habit. Elias Thorne had left behind a purpose, a silent, endless study session in the dark, polished heart of the old lab, a permanent reflection of a mind that never stopped questioning, forever holding the vessel of its curiosity. The town of Crestwood, nestled in a valley in British Columbia, had a rhythm dictated by the lumber mill and the turning of the seasons. Crestwood Secondary School, a low-slung modern building from the 1970s, reflected this practicality. Its halls were functional, its lighting efficient. But at the end of the east wing was a room that felt apart from all that: the senior art studio. It was Ms. Anya Sharma's domain. She was a woman in her late 30s, with kind eyes and fingers permanently stained with a faint rainbow of pigments. To her, the art room was a sacred space, a laboratory of potential where the air itself seemed thick with creativity, smelling of turpentine, wet clay, and the dusty organic scent of charcoal. The room was a beautiful chaos. Pottery wheels stood like silent sentinels. Canvases in various states of completion leaned against walls splattered with a history of every color imaginable. And in one corner, largely ignored, stood Old Reliable, a heavy wooden easel of dark scarred oak, a relic from the school's original building. Its screws were perpetually loose, and one of its legs was slightly shorter than the others, causing it to list to the left with a stubborn, charming dignity. The mystery began on a Monday in October. Anya arrived early, as was her habit, to enjoy the quiet room before the storm of adolescent energy arrived. She put on the kettle for her morning tea and began her usual visual sweep of the room. Her eyes landed on Old Reliable. There was a fresh, primed canvas on it. This was odd. She was meticulous about supplies. All unused canvases were stored in the tall metal cupboard, and the easel was always cleared at the end of the day. She walked over, assuming a student had gotten overzealous. But the canvas wasn't just placed there. It was secured properly, the tension adjusters tightened with care. And in the center of the stark white surface was a single bold smudge of charcoal. It was a rough, almost aggressive mark, a dark cloud in the middle of a white sky. It felt intentional. Puzzled, she removed the canvas, stored it with the other in-progress works, and went about her day. She asked her senior class if anyone had stayed behind, but was met with blank stares. The next morning it happened again. A fresh canvas on Old Reliable, and on it, 2 charcoal marks now. The first, central smudge, and a second, lighter one, trailing away from it like a passing thought. It was still abstract, but the composition felt deliberate, as if a conversation had begun. A cold finger of unease traced Anya's spine. She checked the doors and windows. All were locked. The school's night custodian, a cheerful man named Dave, swore he saw nothing out of the ordinary. There was no rational explanation. The phenomenon continued. Every morning a new canvas would be on the easel and the drawing would have progressed. The random smudges began to coalesce to suggest form. A faint, sweeping line hinted at a jawline. A cluster of darker marks suggested the hollow of an eye socket. It was a portrait emerging from the chaos, like a face materializing from fog. Anya stopped removing the canvas. Instead, she began to document it. She took a photograph each morning before her students arrived. The progression was undeniable, and it was skilled. The hand that made these marks understood anatomy, light, and shadow. This was no prank. This was a work in progress, created between the hours of midnight and dawn. The atmosphere in the art room changed. The students, once they learned of the ghost artist, as they dubbed it, treated the easel with a kind of reverent curiosity. They would gather around it each morning, analyzing the new marks, debating the emerging face. It became their shared secret, a mystery that bound them together. But for Anya, it was more personal. She felt she was witnessing something intimate, a solitary act of creation happening in the heart of her sanctuary. She started staying later, sitting in the dim room long after everyone had left, hoping to catch a glimpse of the artist. But the room remained stubbornly, creatively empty. The work only happened in the absolute solitude of the deep night. Driven by a need to understand, she delved into the school's history. In the library's archives, she found a box of old art department records. Buried beneath faded course catalogues was a single, worn portfolio. Inside were sketches, beautiful, haunting, technically masterful drawings. They were all self-portraits, signed with a flowing JB. The dates were from the late 1970s, the first years of the school. The librarian, an elderly woman who had been a student herself at Crestwood, remembered. "Julian Bell," she said, her voice soft with memory. "A brilliant boy, painfully shy. He lived and breathed art. He was here all the time, especially in that old art room in the original building. He had a scholarship to a prestigious art college lined up for the fall." "What happened?" Anya asked, though she already sensed the answer. "Aneurysm," the librarian said simply. "Summer after graduation, he was just gone." The school was rebuilt a few years later. They salvaged what they could from the old art room. That easel, I think that was his. Anya's heart ached. Julian Bell, a life of immense potential, severed before it could truly begin. His portfolio was filled with self-portraits, a young man trying to find his own face, his own identity through his art. And he had died with his final greatest self-portrait unfinished. She understood now. The easel wasn't haunted by a ghost, but by an ambition. It was a vessel for an artistic purpose that had been interrupted. Julian's final, unfinished work was not a painting on a wall, but the very act of creation itself. The school had been rebuilt, his old studio gone, but his need to create, to define himself on the canvas, had persisted, latching onto the one object that had been his constant companion, old, reliable. Back in the art room, Anya looked at the latest progression on the canvas. The portrait was now unmistakable. A young man with intense eyes, high cheekbones and a sensitive mouth. It was Julian Bell. The drawing was breathtaking, full of a raw, searching energy. It was better than anything in his portfolio. It was the masterpiece he never got to finish. That night, Anya didn't go home. She sat in the dark art room, hidden behind a stack of canvases, and waited. The moon rose, casting long, pale shapes across the floor. The school settled into its deepest silence. She watched Old Reliable, a dark shape in the gloom. Then just after 2 a.m., it began. There was no figure, no apparition, but the charcoal stick, which she had left neatly in the tray attached to the easel, lifted into the air. It was not held by a visible hand. It simply floated, poised a few inches above the canvas, and then it moved. It was a dance, a beautiful, silent, heartbreaking dance. The charcoal touched the canvas with a series of soft, scratching sounds. Scritch, scritch, scritch. A line was deepened here, a shadow was softened there. The portrait gained depth, nuance, life. The floating charcoal moved with a confident, fluid grace, the movements of an artist completely absorbed in his work. Anya watched, tears streaming silently down her face. She was not watching a ghost. She was witnessing a soul at its purpose. This was Julian Bell, forever on the cusp of his greatness, forever perfecting his own image, forever completing the work that would define him. She crept out before dawn, leaving him to his silent labor. The next morning, the portrait was more alive than ever. It was nearly finished. The students gathered around it, sensing they were witnessing a miracle approaching its conclusion. And then, one morning, it was done. The canvas on Old Reliable held a finished self-portrait. It was stunning. Every line was confident, every shadow perfectly placed. The eyes in the portrait seemed to look out, not in fear or sadness, but with a quiet, profound understanding. It was the work of a master. Anya knew it was over. She carefully, reverently, took the canvas from the easel. She did not store it away. She had it professionally framed and hung it in a place of honor in the art room with a small, discreet plaque that read simply, "Julian Bell, forever creating." The next morning and every morning after, Old Reliable stood empty. The nightly creation had ceased. The purpose had been fulfilled. The masterpiece was complete. But sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the light slants just so through the high windows, Anya will glance at the old, listing easel, and she will see the charcoal stick in its tray tremble just for a second, as if touched by a passing breeze or a remembered impulse. A gentle reminder that while the final portrait may be complete, the spirit of creation, once ignited, never truly goes away. It simply rests, waiting for the next blank canvas, the next silent night. London in the Blitz was a city of opposites. By day, life carried on with a stubborn, bruised normality. By night, it descended into a roaring, fire-lit hell. The city became a map of light and shadow, its streets canyons of darkness, its sky a ceiling of searchlights and falling incendiaries. In the borough of Camden, the red brick Victorian bulk of St. Ignatius School stood as a reluctant fortress, its windows crisscrossed with tape, its sandbagged entrance a grim mouth. For the duration of the war, it was not a school. It was Air Raid Patrol Post 17, a nerve center for the local civil defense. Its echoing hallways, once filled with the recitation of times tables, now housed bunk beds and first aid stations. The headmaster's study, with its oak-paneled walls and leaded windows, became the operations room. Here, reports from fire watchers and wardens would filter in, plotted on a large map of the borough, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the tense, clipped language of emergency. The head of Post 17 was a man named Captain Alistair Finch, a veteran of the First War, his body too broken for the front lines, but his mind sharp and his will unyielding. His second in command was a young, fiercely intelligent wireless operator named Eleanor, whose fingers could dance across the Morse key with the speed of a concert pianist. And there was Corporal Miller, a steady, reliable man who coordinated the ground teams. They were an island of order in a sea of chaos, their lives reduced to the static crackle of the radio and the earth-shaking percussion of the bombs. The story that would become the echo began on the night of May 10th, 1941, the last and most devastating night of the Blitz. The Luftwaffe came in waves, and London burned. The reports flooding into Post 17 were apocalyptic. Entire streets were vanishing. The phone lines were dead. Their only link to the outside world was the wireless, and even that was fraying, filled with the ghostly interference of a city being torn apart. At 23:47, a final broken transmission came through from a fire-watching team trapped in a collapsing warehouse on the edge of their sector. Their position was being overrun by fire. They were requesting, then begging for assistance. Captain Finch made a decision. He couldn't send his exhausted ground teams into that inferno, but he could try to guide them out. He ordered Eleanor to maintain contact, to feed them a route through the burning streets. He stood over the map, his face lit by the single shaded lamp, moving tokens that represented men as the world exploded around them. For 20 minutes, it worked. The team, guided by Eleanor's calm, steady voice through the crackling ether, reported their progress. They were close, so close. And then, at 008, a direct hit on a gas main 2 streets away. The concussion blew out the remaining windows of St. Ignatius. The map table overturned. The world went black and silent, the only sound a high-pitched ringing in their ears. When the dust settled and the emergency lanterns were lit, the wireless was dead. A final static-filled shriek was all that remained of the transmission. The fire-watching team was never heard from again. They were listed as missing, presumed killed, their bodies lost in the rubble and fire. Captain Finch never forgave himself. He had stayed at his post, directing others to their deaths from the safety of a schoolroom. The war ended, the sandbags were removed, and St. Ignatius became a school once more. But the memory of that night, of the lost patrol and the broken transmission, clung to the old building like a stain. Decades later, in the 1990s, the school underwent a massive renovation. The old oak-paneled study, the former operations room, was to be converted into a modern IT suite. The work was led by a foreman named Joe, a pragmatic Londoner in his 40s with a healthy skepticism for anything that couldn't be explained by a faulty wire or a loose pipe. The anomalies began on the first day of demolition inside the study. The crew reported hearing things, not ghosts, but sounds. The faint, clipped sound of booted footsteps marching in unison down the main corridor outside. When they went to look, the hallway was empty. They heard the soft, insistent crackle of vintage radio static, seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. It was always brief and always followed by an oppressive, listening silence. Joe dismissed it as old pipes and the power tools playing tricks on their ears. But the stories persisted. A young electrician, working late to run cables through the ceiling void, came down white-faced, swearing he'd heard a woman's voice, calm and clear, saying, "Turn left at the bakery. Proceed with caution. Incendiaries ahead." The climax came when they began to tear down the old interior wall of the study. As the sledgehammer struck the plaster, the air in the room seemed to thicken. And then, it played out. It was not a visual apparition. It was a sonic one. A perfect looping recording of a moment in time. First, the crisp, unmistakable sound of booted footsteps marching in perfect unison down the corridor. They were not hesitant or lost. They were purposeful, direct. They stopped outside the door of the old study. Then the sound of a heavy, old-fashioned door swinging open, a man's voice, older, authoritative, strained with tension. "Report." A burst of intense, urgent static from a vintage wireless set, the kind that hasn't been used in half a century. A younger woman's voice, clear and focused, cutting through the static. "Trapped. Fires cutting off the eastern route. Requesting alternate." Her voice was swallowed by another wave of static. The man's voice again, sharp with command and a buried desperation. "Maintain signal. Guide them through, Eleanor, that's an order." Another burst of static, this one ending in a sudden, deafening roar, the sound of a massive explosion from very close by, the sound of shattering glass, falling debris, and then a final chilling sound, the long, dying hiss of a radio signal going dead. A flat, empty silence. And then, the sound of the boots, marching away, fading down the hall. The mission, eternally unfinished, was over. The door swung shut. The workmen stood frozen, their tools hanging limp in their hands. The sounds had been so real, so three-dimensional, they felt they could have reached out and touched the static. Joe, the foreman, felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with ghosts and everything to do with the raw human tragedy he had just witnessed. He called a halt to the work and went to the local library, to the archives. He found the records for St. Ignatius, for the war. He found the logs for Patrol Post 17, and he found the entry for May 10th, 1941. The last logged transmission. The names of the lost fire-watching team, the name of the wireless operator, Eleanor, the name of the commander, Captain Finch. He understood. This was not a random haunting. The stress and trauma of that final failed mission had been so immense, the moment of its catastrophic failure so definitive, that it had been recorded into the very fabric of the room, into the oak panels and the plaster. The renovation, the physical disturbance of that space, was playing the recording back, like a needle finding a groove on a phonograph record, etched by despair. Joe went back to the site. He didn't call an exorcist. He gathered his crew and explained what he had found. He told them about Captain Finch and Eleanor and the lost patrol. He reframed the sounds, not as a frightening ghost story, but as a memorial, an echo of real courage and a real tragedy. When they resumed work, they did so with a new reverence. They weren't just dismantling a room, they were carefully disassembling a monument. The sounds never returned. It was as if, by being heard, by being understood and respected, the echo had finally been allowed to fade. The new IT suite is bright and modern, filled with the quiet hum of computers. The children who learn there have no knowledge of the war, of the maps and the radios and the desperate voices. But sometimes, on the anniversary of that terrible night in May, if the school is utterly silent, a janitor making his rounds might pause, thinking he hears the faintest crackle of static from behind a wall or the distant rhythmic echo of a march that never reached its destination. It is the building remembering, whispering the story of the lost patrol, a final, faithful report from a night the world was on fire. The town of Magnolia Grove, Mississippi, wore its history like a fine, if slightly faded, linen suit. Live oaks draped with Spanish moss formed a canopy over streets lined with antebellum homes, their white pillars standing as proud, silent sentinels to a past that was both beautiful and complicated. At the end of Magnolia Avenue stood the new Magnolia Grove High School, a sleek, air-conditioned complex of glass and steel built in 2005. It was a symbol of progress, of a future looking firmly forward. But the land it was built upon held a memory, a scar tissue over a deep and tender wound. For beneath the pristine football field and the modern science wings lay the foundation of the old Magnolia Grove High, a grand, columned building whose heart had been a magnificent 1,000-seat auditorium. And in the spring of 1962, that heart had stopped beating. A faulty wire in the lighting rig had sparked a fire that raced through the dry, old timber of the stage. The blaze had been fierce and fast, consuming velvet curtains, carved wooden balconies, and decades of school memories. The grand piano, a Steinway that had been donated by a wealthy plantation family in the 1920s, was lost to the inferno. All that remained was a foundation of scorched brick and a collective grief that lingered in the town's older generation. For the students of the new school, this was ancient history, a story their grandparents told. But for the school's music teacher, Mr. David Chen, it became a present and deeply personal mystery. David was a pragmatist, a man who believed in the tangible, the vibration of a string, the resonance of a well-tuned soundboard, the precise mathematics of musical notation. He had left a promising career in Atlanta to teach in Magnolia Grove, seeking a quieter life. His sanctuary was the new music wing, a soundproofed marvel with digital keyboards and a state-of-the-art recording studio. It began subtly. He would be working late, grading papers or arranging a score, and he would hear it. A faint, distant strain of music. It wasn't coming from the speakers or a student's phone. It was acoustic, and it was old. The sound of an out-of-tune piano, the notes slightly flat, the bass register having a hollow, woolen quality. At first, he dismissed it as an auditory hallucination, the product of a mind oversaturated with sound. But the tunes were always the same. Fragments of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, the melancholic strains of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, and occasionally the jaunty, syncopated rhythm of a Scott Joplin rag. He started asking the night custodian, a man named Ray, who had gone to the old school. "Ray, you ever hear music, late at night, like an old piano?" Ray had stopped his floor buffer, his face unreadable. "You hear it too, huh?" he'd said, his voice low. "Most folks can't, or won't admit it. That's the fire piano. My daddy said they never could salvage nothing from that Steinway, not even the iron frame." David's scientific mind rebelled. A ghost piano? It was impossible. Sound was physics. It needed a source, a medium, a receiver. A piano that no longer existed could not produce sound waves. Driven by a need for a rational explanation, he brought equipment from the recording studio, a high-sensitivity parabolic microphone and a low-frequency receiver. He stayed late one Tuesday, setting up his gear in the hallway that ran closest to the old foundation, now buried beneath the school's new east wing. The digital clock on his recorder glowed, 11:47 p.m. The school was silent. He put on his headphones, the high-end drivers capable of reproducing the subtlest of sounds. For an hour, there was nothing but the faint hum of the building's electrical grid. Then, at 12:52 a.m., it began. It was faint at first, a single resonant A-flat, sustained. Then another note, a C. They formed a chord, dissonant and beautiful. It was unmistakably the opening of Rhapsody in Blue, that iconic wailing clarinet trill translated into the language of a slightly out-of-tune piano. The sound was not coming from the walls or the vents. Through the headphones, it seemed to be emanating from the floor itself, from the very concrete slab upon which the school was built. David watched, mesmerized and unnerved, as the needles on his analog VU meters danced, registering sound waves that were physically impossible. He was recording silence, or rather, he was recording a sound that had no physical source in his dimension of reality. It was a memory, playing itself out through the scar tissue of the land. He began to research the old school, spending his weekends in the Town Historical Society. He found a program from the spring concert of 1962, the last performance before the fire. The finale was to be a performance of Rhapsody in Blue by a senior named Eleanor Ellie Vance. He found a yearbook photo of her. She had a bright, intelligent face with eyes that sparkled with a fierce joy. The caption below read, "Ellie Vance, our piano prodigy, headed to Juilliard in the fall." He tracked down an obituary. Eleanor Vance had not died in the fire. The obituary was from 2019. She had lived a long life, had become a respected music teacher herself, and had never returned to Magnolia Grove after that summer. The fire had not taken her life, but it had stolen her stage, her instrument, her moment of triumph. David understood. The phantom piano was not a record of a death. It was the echo of an interrupted dream. Ellie Vance's final perfect rehearsal, the night before the concert that never was, had been so charged with anticipation, so imbued with her talent and passion, that it had been seared into the very location. The land was not haunted by her ghost, but by her ambition, by the music that was supposed to have been her launch into a brilliant future. He went back, night after night, not with recording equipment, but just to listen. He would sit on the cool linoleum floor of the empty hallway, close his eyes, and let the faint, out-of-tune music wash over him. He heard the passion in the phrases, the subtle rubato, the moments of powerful crescendo. He was listening to the ghost of a performance, a young woman pouring her entire soul into a doomed instrument. One night, as the phantom piano began the complex, arpeggiated runs of the Chopin Nocturne, David did something impulsive. He went to the music room, unlocked the door, and wheeled out a portable electric keyboard. He set it up in the hallway, directly over the spot where the sound seemed strongest. He turned the volume low, found the key, and began to play. He didn't play over the phantom music. He played with it. He provided the harmony, the missing notes, the support for the lonely, spectral melody. His modern, perfectly in-tune digital sounds wove around the ancient, slightly flat acoustic ones, filling in the gaps, completing the chords. For a few breathtaking measures, the two pianos, one real, one remembered, played together. It was a duet across time, a conversation between the present and a lost past. The phantom music seemed to gain strength, to become clearer, more confident, as if grateful for the accompaniment. And then, as the nocturne reached its quiet, unresolved conclusion, the phantom piano played its final fading note and fell silent. The duet was over. The phantom piano never played again. David would sometimes sit in the hallway waiting, but only the hum of the school answered him. Ellie Vance's interrupted rehearsal had, at last, found its resolution. The music had been heard, truly heard, and in that hearing, it had found peace. David never told anyone what he had done. But sometimes when he is teaching a particularly gifted student, he will take them to that specific spot in the hallway. "Listen," he will say, his voice quiet. Not with your ears, but with your heart. Can you hear it? The echo of a dream. And if the student is very still and the school is very quiet, they will feel it. Not a sound, but a feeling, a vibration of immense potential and poignant loss. A silent music that reminds them that some art is so powerful it can never truly be silenced, not even by fire. It simply waits, in the foundations of the world, for a willing ear to complete its song. The Beaumont Archives at the University of Texas were not so much a library as a fortress of silence. Housed in a wing added in the 1920s, it was a place of hushed reverence, where the air was kept cool and dry, and the light was perpetually dim to protect the treasures within. The walls were lined with dark oak, and the only sounds were the soft rhythmic sigh of the climate control and the occasional, almost ceremonial click of a librarian's computer keyboard. This was a world of first editions, illuminated manuscripts, and fragile letters from centuries past. Each item a frozen moment of human thought. The heart of this sanctum was the Special Collections reading room, a space so quiet one could hear the settling of dust. Here, under the watchful eyes of librarians and discreet security cameras, scholars handled history with white cotton gloves. The books were not shelved openly. They were kept in a locked, climate-controlled vault and had to be requested one at a time. Security was the domain of a man named Ben Carter. A former Marine with a calm demeanor and an eye for detail, Ben had been the night supervisor for 6 years. His rounds were precise, his logs meticulous. He appreciated the order of the archives, the way every book had its place, every artifact its record. It was a world built on certainty. The anomaly began not with a sound, but with a digital ghost in the machine. It was a Tuesday, just after 2 a.m. Ben was at his station, reviewing the night's motion sensor logs. The system was state-of-the-art, a grid of infrared eyes that covered every corridor and room. A log entry caught his eye. Motion detected, Special Collections Vault A, time 01:47:03, duration 2 seconds. His first thought was a malfunction. A moth, a dust mote caught in a beam of air from a vent. It happened. He pulled up the live camera feed for Vault A. The room was a long, narrow space with rows of floor-to-ceiling glass-fronted cabinets. It was dark, still, and utterly empty. He rewound the recording to 01:47 and watched. For 3 seconds, nothing. Then a single sharp blip on the motion sensor overlay, highlighting one of the bottom cabinets on the far wall. The camera showed no movement, no change in the shadows. The blip lasted for 2 seconds and vanished. The sensor had registered something, but the camera had seen nothing. Ben made a note in his log. Probable sensor glitch, Vault A, to be monitored. It happened again the next night, and the night after that, always between 1:45 and 1:50 a.m., always the same sensor, always a duration of 2 or 3 seconds, and the camera, without fail, showed nothing. This was no longer a glitch. This was a pattern that defied the ordered reality of his world. He decided to investigate physically. On the 4th night, at 1:40 a.m., he unlocked the door to Vault A and stepped inside. The air was several degrees cooler, smelling of old paper and chilled metal. He stood silently, his flashlight off, letting his eyes adjust to the emergency lighting's soft glow. He watched the cabinet in question, A17. At 1:47 a.m. he heard it. It was the softest of sounds. A faint, dry, almost brittle shff sound, like a single page of very old, very dry paper being gently turned. It came from inside cabinet A17. Ben's blood ran cold, not from fear, but from a profound sense of violation. Nothing was supposed to be in that cabinet that could make that sound. The books were sealed, protected. He strode over, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence, and shone his flashlight through the glass. The cabinet contained a single priceless item, a first edition collection of poetry by John Keats, published in 1820. It was one of the archive's crown jewels, kept in a custom-made acid-free box. The box was closed. The book was inside. It could not, by any physical law, have its pages turned. Yet, the sound had been unmistakable. The next day, Ben did his research. He went to the head archivist, Dr. Aris Thorne, a woman whose life was dedicated to the stories behind the books. He showed her the censor logs, careful not to mention the sound he had heard. Dr. Thorne adjusted her spectacles, her expression one of academic curiosity rather than alarm. Fascinating. Cabinet A17, that's the Keats volume. Poems, 1820. It contains Lamia, Isabella, and the Eve of St. Agnes. She pulled up the item's history on her computer. It has a notable provenance. It was once owned by a young scholar named Alistair Finch. He was quite brilliant by all accounts, a prodigy in romantic poetry. He donated his entire collection to the university in the 1950s, this volume being his most prized possession. What happened to him? Ben asked. Dr. Thorne's face grew somber. He died young, tuberculosis. He was only 26. The story goes that he was working on a groundbreaking thesis about Keats, right here in this very library. He was known for his intensity. He would become so absorbed in a text that the world around him would fade away. He was found at his carrel in the old reading room, this very book open in front of him. He had simply stopped. Ben felt the pieces click into place, forming a picture as haunting as it was clear. Alistair Finch, a young man whose life had been defined by his passion for poetry, cut short in the midst of his study. That night, Ben set up a different kind of watch. He didn't enter the vault. Instead, he positioned a high-resolution, low-light camera directly in front of cabinet A17, linked to his monitor at the security station. He also disabled the motion sensor alarm for that cabinet to avoid a paper trail of glitches. At 1:46 a.m., he focused entirely on the screen. The cabinet was dark, the Keats box a pale, rectangular shape inside. At 1:47:15 it happened. The box did not open. No lid was raised. But for a fraction of a second, a faint, shimmering distortion appeared in the air just in front of the glass, like heat haze on a summer road. It had no form, no substance. And in that same instant, the Keats volume, inside its sealed box, slid forward a precise inch. It was a movement so small, so deliberate, it was almost imperceptible. But on the high-resolution camera, it was undeniable. The book moved. Then, it slid back into its original position. Shuff. Ben heard the sound again, not through the vault door, but in his mind a perfect auditory memory synchronized with the visual event. The page turn, the silent, impossible reading. He watched, his breath caught in his throat as the phenomenon repeated itself twice more over the next minute. Each time, the same heat haze distortion, the same 1-inch slide of the book, the same soft phantom sound of a turning page. He understood now. This was not a haunting in the traditional sense, it was a ritual, a habit of scholarship so deeply ingrained that it had transcended the scholar's own mortality. Alistair Finch was not a ghost trying to communicate, he was a scholar who had never stopped studying. His final, unfinished reading of Keats was caught in an endless loop, a moment of academic rapture frozen in time. Ben never reported it. He deleted the dedicated camera feed and re-enabled the motion sensor, letting its nightly 2-second blip become just another part of the archive's routine data, a secret known only to him. He had become the guardian not just of the books, but of the quiet, eternal student who lived among them. He began to think of Alistair not as an intruder, but as the archive's most dedicated patron. Sometimes, on his rounds, Ben would pause outside Vault A at precisely 1:47 a.m. He wouldn't look inside. He would simply stand there for a moment, a silent acknowledgement between one keeper of the peace and another. He had learned that some stories are not meant to be checked out or filed away. Some stories are so powerful, so beloved, that they simply refuse to end. And in the deepest hour of the night, in the most silent room of the library, one of the greatest love affairs between a reader and his book continues, page by unseen page, forever. Chicago is a city built on layers, both metaphorical and literal. Its streets are a grid of relentless logic, but beneath them lies a labyrinthine history of forgotten tunnels, raised foundations, and the ghosts of structures that came before. Lincoln Park High School, a hulking fortress-like building from the 1920s, was no exception. It stood as a bastion of education, its limestone facade grimly enduring the wind that whipped off the lake. But its true character was hidden below ground, in a place few students ever saw: the sub-basement. This was a realm of pure function, a world of dripping pipes, throbbing boilers, and the low, constant hum of machinery that kept the world above functioning. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete, hot oil, and ozone from the electrical panels. Flickering fluorescent tubes cast a sickly light on a floor perpetually slick with condensation. For the engineering and maintenance crew, the sub-basement was their kingdom. And their king was Rosa. Rosa Mendez was the chief engineer, a compact woman in her 50s with a graying braid, hands scarred by a lifetime of wrestling with stubborn valves, and a no-nonsense demeanor that commanded respect. She knew every pipe, every wire, every groan and sigh of the school's ancient circulatory system. And she knew about the cold spot. It wasn't on any blueprint. It wasn't caused by a draft or a faulty air conditioning line. It was in the oldest section of the sub-basement, a corner near the original coal chute, now bricked up. The space was used for storing obsolete parts, broken desks, a stack of slate blackboards, a rusting film projector from a bygone era. The cold spot was a perfect circle, about 6 feet in diameter. To step into it was an immediate physiological shock. The temperature would plummet at least 20 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a pocket of deep, invasive cold that defied all the laws of thermodynamics governing the space around it. A thermometer placed in its center would confirm the drop, the mercury shrinking back in its glass prison. But more unsettling than the cold was the feeling. It felt repulsive. Rosa had discovered it her first week on the job 20 years ago. Her predecessor, a grizzled old-timer named Hank, had shown her. "That there," he'd said, pointing a grease-stained finger, "is the school's appendix. Useless, and you don't mess with it. You feel a push, you back off. Simple as that." Simple as he was right. When you stood at the edge of the cold spot, nothing happened. But the moment you took a step into its circumference, an unmistakable force would press against your chest. It wasn't a wind. It was a solid, immovable pressure, like leaning into a pane of invisible glass. It was a gentle but firm, unequivocal no. Over the years, Rosa had seen new hires, skeptical and brawny, try to challenge it. They'd laugh, puff out their chests, and stride in, only to be stopped short, their faces shifting from arrogance to confusion to a primal unease. They would always step back, muttering excuses about weird drafts. They never tried again. Rosa, being a scientist at heart, had experimented. She'd rolled a heavy ball bearing into the spot. It had stopped dead at the invisible boundary, as if it had hit a wall, before rolling back a few inches. She'd tried a drone. Its motors had whined in protest, and it had lost its signal, drifting lifelessly to the floor just outside the circle. The cold spot rejected intrusion. It wanted to be left alone. The school above was a cacophony of life, slamming lockers, shouted conversations, the ringing of bells. But down here, in this subterranean silence, the cold spot was a void, a bubble of negative space that seemed to absorb sound and warmth and ambition. It was the one part of her domain Rosa could not fix, could not understand, and had learned respectfully to avoid. The mystery of it gnawed at her. It was a problem without a solution, a broken component she couldn't replace. During a slow summer, she decided to investigate the school's archives, a dusty room in the administration building. She was looking for the original building plans, for any clue about what might have been on that exact spot before the school was built. The plans showed nothing unusual, but in a box of unsorted documents from the city's historical commission, she found a map from 1871, the year of the Great Chicago Fire. The map showed the old street layouts before the fire reshaped the city, and there, precisely where Lincoln Park High now stood, was a small, neat notation marking the location of the St. Bridget's Orphanage and Foundling Home. Her heart beat a little faster. She dug deeper, ordering microfiche records of old city ledgers. She found the record of the orphanage's fate. It had not burned in the Great Fire. It had been consumed by a different tragedy. In the harsh winter of 1872, a pneumonia outbreak had swept through the overcrowded home. The children, already weak and malnourished, had fallen quickly. In a desperate attempt to quarantine the sick and protect the healthy, the matron, a severe but devoted woman named Sister Agnes, had ordered the sickest children moved to the coal cellar, the coldest part of the building, hoping the low temperatures would slow the disease. It had not. Dozens of children had died in that dark, freezing space, isolated from the world, with only the stern, frightened comfort of the nuns. The city, wanting to forget the tragedy, had torn the orphanage down a few years later. The land had lain fallow until the school was built directly on top of it, its sub-basement unknowingly constructed over the old coal cellar. Rosa went back down to the sub-basement that night, long after everyone had left. She stood at the edge of the cold spot, but this time she didn't feel fear or frustration. She felt a profound, aching sorrow. This wasn't a malicious presence. It was a scar, a collective memory of suffering, of isolation, of a final, desperate attempt to survive. The cold wasn't a supernatural phenomenon. It was the psychic residue of that terrible winter, the memory of the chill that had taken those young lives. And the pushing sensation? It wasn't a warning. It was a protection, a final, enduring act of care. A force field erected by the echoes of the past, not to keep people out, but to keep the memory of that suffering contained, to prevent its bleak despair from leaking out into the world above. It was a quarantine that had never been lifted. She looked at the stack of broken desks and the old projector. She realized this forgotten corner with its rejected, obsolete items was the perfect place for such a memory to reside. From that day on, Rosa's relationship with the cold spot changed. She no longer saw it as a problem to be solved. She saw it as a memorial she was tasked with guarding. She instructed her crew to give the area a wide berth, to never store anything new there. She would sometimes, on her rounds, pause at a respectful distance. One day, a new, over-eager facilities manager ordered her to clear out the junk in the old sub-basement corner to make space for new HVAC parts. Rosa refused. "You can't put anything there," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Why not?" "It's just a damp corner," the manager retorted. Rosa looked him straight in the eye. "It's occupied," she said simply. He scoffed, but something in her unwavering gaze stopped him from pressing further. The corner remained untouched. The cold spot of Lincoln Park High was not a haunting. It was a wound in the earth that had never healed. A pocket of profound loss so potent it had physically manifested a permanent winter of the soul. And Rosa, the pragmatic engineer, had become its unexpected custodian, ensuring that this one, silent, frozen echo of forgotten children would at least be left in peace, its invisible protective barrier honored by the living who walked, unknowingly, just above. If you found calm in this exploration, or if sleep is already pulling you under, know that you are safe and sound. The halls are quiet, the stories are at rest, and the world outside is peaceful. Thank you for sharing this time with Silent Souls. If you'd like to continue these gentle journeys, you are always welcome to subscribe. But for now, there is nothing more to do. Allow your eyes to grow heavy, your breathing to slow, and let these echoes lull you into a deep and dreamless sleep. Good night.